Hey guys, welcome to Mastering the Middle Game. I'm Grandmaster Eric Hansen, and today I wanted to show a game of mine from a few years ago. It was at the FIDE World Cup. I was in a must-win situation, playing against a Russian 2700 nuclear physicist, Vladimir Malakhov. I'd lost the first game. It was a 2-game match. This was in Norway 3 years ago. And yeah, so I had to, this was a must win. Start out e4, e5. I expected the Berlin, or I expected my opponent to play solid because all black needed was a draw. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, that's what I've almost always played. And knight f6, so, you know, this isn't a boring Berlin game. Nobody needs to leave yet. It turned out to be a bit exciting. I did expect the Berlin, and at that time, there were still chances to fight a little bit. So knight f6, I didn't want to go into the endgame. That's d3. So for anybody who plays e4 and encounters the Berlin, you know, you can castle, and that's the famous endgame that Kasparov struggled against Kramnik with. There's a lot of history there. It's pretty theoretical, but black does very well. I didn't want to test my Russian opponent in an endgame. Just, you know, simply as that. I'm not the best endgame player. So I wanted to keep pieces on the board and keep chances. So I played d3, bishop c5, and c3. Actually, the reason why I play c3 instead of castling here, which is very normal, is once again fueled by the fact I did not want to trade pieces. Why? So let's say I castle. Actually, black can play knight d4. And that just trades off. Just another pair of pieces, makes it a bit simpler, but I was looking to keep as many pieces on the board. So that's already why I play a move like c3. Black castles. I castled now, and rook e8. Rook e8 is a really common move, especially when you have a bishop, when you have this bishop developed and you castle quickly. A lot of times you may find that bishop lacking space or just under a little bit of pressure. And the benefit of a move like rook e8 over a move like d6 is when you play d6 here, you're committing the bishop to going this direction. Why my opponent decided to play rook e8, which is a bit less common, is that he's like, you know what, maybe my bishop is going to go all the way back to f8. Or it will go to a7, but I'm leaving myself the option of that. I had never seen this move before in this specific structure, but it wasn't you know, conceptually hard to understand. So rook e8, I decided to copy. Rook e1. Rook e1 is very common in the Roy Lopez structure that we kind of have, because at some point white with a pawn on c3, a pawn leaver would like to play d4 and try to challenge the center. And e4 is going to be a problem when that happens. E4 is attacked by the knight and eventually the rook when this happens. So rook e1, natural move. And bishop f8. So he decided to put the bishop this way. This was his preparation. There's good and bad things about it, but yeah, I mean, the bishop is going to go to f8 before playing d6 or maybe d5. So after bishop f8, I wasn't sure if black was wanting to play d6 or d5. And I was looking at a bunch of options, but I was thinking to myself, I don't know this opening too well, and maybe he's prepared for the standard moves. And for those who have studied Spanish structures, a standard move here might be knight knight d2, knight f1, and knight g3. That's a really common way to get that knight into the game because I've already played c3. My knight can't go to c3. So I want to get my knight. So that's just that would be a really common sequence, or h3 or something like that. And I was just like, I can do this, but I feel like maybe seeing if something else can be done in this position. I don't want to just rely on, I feel like if I just play the generic moves, my opponent maybe has something in store for that. So I decided to force the issue after bishop f8 and play d4. Because usually black does play d6 here. d6 is normally played. The bishop does not normally go to f8. And one benefit for white of the bishop going to f8 is that d4, is under, well, I can get d4 a lot easier. There's no bishop on that square. So I played d4. Okay, this is still in the opening phase, although I have no idea, like, I'm not in theory. In this case, there's a few different options here for black. You can try to play d6 and not give up the center. There's a6 here as well. I was considering a6. No, a6 just blunders a pawn. You can't play a6. Yeah, a6 to attack the bit. The pawn. The pawn is hanging. So d6 was the only move besides taking here. I mean, the idea I had, well, I wanted to make the position pretty sharp, was after e takes d4, it might look like this pawn is hanging. So for example, if pawn takes d4, knight takes e4. That's just simple math. There's two pieces attacking e4, yes? So my opponent did e takes d4 here. Pretty logical. But now things get very sharp. I have to play e5. That's the whole plan behind this move. My pawn is hanging, so I'm going to first play e5, make sure it's no longer hanging, and then I'm going to recapture on d4. So after e5, one thing is my opponent took a lot of time here, so we were pretty much out of theory, and it was going to be a sharp position. After e5, knight d5. You don't really want to put the knight anywhere else. h5 is a bad square, g4 traps it. g4, they're all pretty shaky, but at least on d5, where my black put it, makes a lot of sense, because it can always go to b6. It has a safe square, whereas the other squares don't really have a safe square. After knight d5, I was, which is what I expected, I took a bit of a think here. I have the option of just taking the pawn back. And this position looks pretty nice for white. I mean, you have the pawn center, a lot of space seemingly. Maybe this bishop is coming to g5. A lot of easy development. But I wasn't sure about this after d6. I wanted, after d6, let's say bishop g5, queen d7. I thought this was a good position, but because it was a must-win game, I was like I was double-checking every single move and trying to be really precise. One thing is, my opponent was 2,700, and I was rated around 2,600 at the time, but I'd never beaten a Super Grandmaster. So it was a must-win game against the caliber of player I'd never really played against, in fact. So I was like really, really nervous. And it was also around this position that former world champion Kramnik came to my game. It's a bit of a funny story. He's the guy who used this opening to defeat Kasparov. So every time he's interested in looking at games that have the opening that he pretty much got into popularity. And we were writing the game. I was writing. You use a score sheet to record your moves, and I had never met, this was one of my first big tournaments. So I had never met a lot of these players, and I wasn't meeting them during the game. But Kramnik was there, he's a really big guy. He comes to my game. I have my paper beside me and my pen, because you're supposed to write. He takes my pen, he moves it away so that he can read my score sheet, but he like takes my pen and like moves my paper and pretty much grabs my score sheet during my move. And if Kramnik does that, I mean, I was just I didn't know, I didn't say anything. I mean, he was a former world champion. He's the best player in this opening. He hadn't seen this type of position before. It was somehow interesting to him, and he just decided to go, you know, he's allowed to do what he wants. I figured that was like some sort of, you know, I'm not going to really say no. I'm like an ant compared to him. So at this moment, I started like, if he's looking at the game, maybe there's also some more possibilities for me, or maybe like it's interesting. I mean, so I was like, okay, maybe there's some different moves here that aren't available. So I was thinking here. I was like, okay, I can obviously recapture the pawn, but maybe I have something a little bit better. And I started looking at this idea. I was looking at the idea of bishop c4, because I know black wants to play d6 next move and get that bishop out and attack my center. So I started looking at moves like bishop c4, and I started having ideas like knight b6, maybe, you know, bishop f7, king f7, knight g5, check. I started looking at this combination, let's say king g8, and queen b3. It came to my mind at least. I felt like, okay, black's bishop is out of the game. This bishop right now is not yet in the game. So here, what I was thinking would actually work, but there's a move like rook e6. Rook e6, and you know, knight e6, and black has two pieces for the rook, and his king is safe. But once I saw that idea, I started thinking a bit more and more, because at least it's reasonable. I realized, okay, I can recapture the pawn either way, but maybe I have a better move first. And that led me to think about queen b3. So I ended up going for queen b3 first. The benefit of queen b3 is that after knight b6, I don't have a bishop being attacked on c4. So queen b3, I wanted to win some time. So queen b3. Black only has one move here, really. I mean, if you're going to play some move like knight d to e7, you're going to have a very bad time after knight g5. So we see situations, though, when black's lack of development is pretty bad. So knight b6. And after knight b6, I took back on d4 and d5 anyways. After d5 is a good move, because black's gaining a lot more space than playing d6. If you can play d5 over d6, you normally do that. D5 blocks the diagonal, of my queen, develops the bishop. And of course, I'm not going to consider this move again because I'm leaving myself with an isolated pawn. Not only that, but there's tactics like rook e1, check, knight takes e1, and knight takes d4. Did you have a question? Oh no, okay. And knight takes d4. So it gets messy, but I can't be happy to be, I don't want to go into any sort of complications when I have all these pieces undeveloped. So c takes d4, d5. So I have to develop. If you can, develop with tempo. Next move, bishop g5. Pretty self-explanatory. I want to develop my bishop. And that move is a bit of attractive because, okay, f6 is not really desirable. So queen d7. And the most natural move here would just be what I'm saying. Just develop the pieces. Don't need to think too much about it. Probably knight c3 or knight d2. Knight c3, h6, maybe bishop f4. But white has a little bit of a space advantage based on the pawns. We have two pawns in the center pushed into black's position, and black still has to figure out how to unravel. Note, my rook is on e1, so in the case of, let's say knight c3, and in the case of a6, am I going to take on c6, or am I going to play like bishop d3 or bishop f1? Am I going to trade off the bishop on c6, or am I going to retreat it? I'm going to retreat. I'm not going to give away the bishop pair without some serious compensation. And I have this f1 square as well. I decided to go for rook c1. And as I said, I was overthinking a little bit in this game, but that's because of the situation. I'd never been in a match. Well, yeah, I'm not used to playing matches, 2-game matches, where I had to win in the second game. So I was really trying to be super precise. And rook c1. And the only idea of rook c1 is pretty clear. I want to take on c6 and double those pawns. So I was looking for a positional imbalance no matter what. And now black pretty much has no way of stopping me from taking on c6 and doubling the pawns. a6, okay. Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and now we have the real imbalance in the position. Now I've given up the bishop pair. I have a structural edge. It's a pretty dynamic position. So knight d2. Why knight d2? Knight c3 blocks the open file. I'd rather put my knight on d2, coordinate my knights, and use that c file so that black can't play c5 and undouble those c pawns. When you have two bishops, you want to open up the position. As white here, I'm trying to play against this, fix it there, keep black passive and reduced to defending that double pawn. Black plays a5, maybe opening up a6 for the bishop. Because once again, I mean, the queen is kind of stuck here. A move like h6 doesn't really change much. I'm just going to play bishop h4. And you're not really going to play g5. And at the same time, you also don't want to trade off bishops as black, probably. Like, black could play this to try to stop my bishop from being such a pain, but if we trade off the dark squared bishops, just an example, I can just play moves like rook c5. I have full control over the dark squares, and it definitely does not look like black will be able to undouble those pawns. So after knight d2, a5, maybe that bishop will go to b7 or a6. Maybe it helps get the bishop there, but black needs to open up the position, and an a6 has some, a5 could potentially do that. What move can white play to kind of, keep that bishop on c8 pretty passive? Otherwise keeping the bishops passive. Queen c2. Thought my queen did its job on b3. So just queen back to c2 and, threatening to win the pawn on c6. The queen's not really on sure footing on b3 anyways. At some point a4, rook b8. There's a few moves. But queen c2 is pretty safe. Maybe then bishop, yeah. So now black played bishop b7. Rook e6, as always, it is possible, but it's not the most human move. Sometimes, yeah, it's not. It really depends. But rook e6 could have been possible, but it is a bit of a clumsy setup there. It was possible though. Bishop b7, and I didn't know why he played bishop b7. I thought he was going to play rook e6. And in this position, I decided in this position to play a4. And knight b3 was an alternative I could have gone for. My idea behind a4 was just to fix the pawn on a5 for some future endgames, and to just, just to fix that pawn, because that is an isolated pawn. I thought it would be maybe a weakness in the future. I didn't think this bishop would stay there forever, so maybe in the future I might also have ideas of knight b3 and bishop d2 and going for that. Maybe you can play knight b3, knight f to d2. I don't know. As long, the thing is, in this game, I just want to make sure not all the pieces be traded off, or we just have tension all the time or potential. And in this position, it's not being resolved anytime soon. So I was just happy about that as long as things weren't being traded off a lot. So a4, fixing that pawn on a5, and my opponent plays knight c4, and I'll be honest, I didn't really consider that move. I mean, I didn't put much thought into knight c4. He played knight c4 like right away, and I was down already 40 minutes on the clock because I was thinking every single move, trying to be pretty precise. Around this part of the game, I realized I need to play faster, otherwise I'm just going to get in time trouble. I can't keep taking this much time, but he plays knight c4 right away. This is a pretty critical moment. Anybody tempted to take on c4? You're tempted? Yeah, you know, there's pawn.
I don't know if it's good, but
There's pawn grabbers. Out of 10 people, there's always going to be a few pawn grabbers. So it has to be looked at. Why isn't knight takes c4 very attractive, though? So how would that go? So let's say knight c4, queen takes c4. Pawn up. And I mean, he played the move instantly, so he evaluated this as just very good. And it's pretty right. If I take 2 pawns, I'm not very happy with my king position here. For the price of 1 pawn, I'm not too happy with my position here.
that's why you should play it.
Yeah, no, I know. That's what I was curious about. I mean, black just opens up the position entirely. There's a few other moves too, but this is compensation. This is pretty substantial positional compensation, king safety. So I decided intuitively just to keep the pieces on the board and play knight f1, and then play b3 anyways. And the benefit is we haven't traded off a pair of pieces. The knight presumably has to just go back to b6, where I don't think it was doing a great job. So I decided, okay, I mean, I can play b3 next move. You can't play c5 right now because b3 and that knight doesn't have anywhere to go. Back to c5, I take, and I'm going to win a piece with c takes b6 or c6 next move. I liked what I did here. Black has no way of stopping b3. I went queen e6. Because it feels like black is playing pretty slowly. He still has this issue of the bishop on b7. 2 bishops are good when they're active. These are not 2 active bishops. They're not bad bishops entirely, but they're not active. White, I feel like most people would probably prefer white's position here. Black is looking ahead. b3 can't be stopped. So with queen e6, so that's a bit of strategical planning. He wants to play, anticipating after b3, the knight is going to drop to d7, to b6 to d7. Because the knight on b6 does not have any scope. So b3, I have to play b3 anyways. Then knight b6, the bishop can drop back to d2 and put long-term pressure on a5. So now knight g3, but knight d7, and this is a very good regrouping because, I mean, after queen e6, I didn't really see a way for me to stop black from playing knight b6, knight d7. I mean, there's no way to stop that. b3, knight b6, knight g3, knight d7. So just regrouping and trying to play for c5. Yes? Bishop e3. I mean, I put my rook on c1. I put so much effort into stopping c5. Okay. My bishop here did its job earlier. Back to e3. Also frees up g5 for my knight in some variations. Bishop e3. I was feeling pretty good after bishop e3, and then he plays c5 instantly. What can you do? c5 is correct. I mean, this is how you play with the 2 bishops. It doesn't stop it stops c5 in the way that I can take it, but if I take on c5, what does that allow black to do? Take the e-pawn, just take the e-pawn, and that's a trade 1 for 1, and that's only going to benefit black, opening up the position, getting rid of white's bind, white's center control. That would erode a lot of my, positional edge. So c5, but at this point, I can't stop it. Knight e2 was another move I was considering. But I went for queen c3. It's the same idea as knight e2. The idea is if black were to take on d4, I'm going to take with my knight. So black gets rid of the double pawns. Let's say queen takes e5. I have queen takes c7 here. Attacking the knight on d7, the bishop on b7. So queen takes, let's say queen takes c5, rook takes c5. Bishop c8, I mean, there aren't really any. And white's better. I mean, white's better. Isolated pawn on a5, isolated pawn on d5. Even though there's two bishops, that's two weaknesses. I'd be happy to, that would be a favorable trade. I mean, I have two weaknesses. Black has some competition, but white's better there with that pawn structure. And the fact that I have a pretty good c file here, you know, rook ac1, it looks unpleasant for black. And that's important because c takes d4. It forces black because I'm attacking the queen and attacking c7. So you don't really have a way to get rid of it. You went c6. Didn't want to go for that variation. After c6, though, I had an idea. I'm happy to see c6 because it means that bishop on b7 is not going to be a monster like it was in some lines. But now I'm forced to trade on c5 because no matter what, black is going to be taking on d4 and e5 will be critically weak. Then black will have all the pressure on e5. So d takes c5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. I didn't have to trade, but I thought bishop d4 and my knight and bishop are better than black's two bishops. I thought the bishop was really well placed on d4, centralized. I'm going to bring my rooks to e1, the only file. And black has this problem with the bishop on b7 still. So queen g5. Rook e1. I kind of have to trade rooks here, just a fight for the file. My knight on g3 doesn't really have a better square. Otherwise, I would probably try to improve that. Maybe I could consider a move like queen f3, but why rook e1 first before a move like queen f3, for example? Why rook e1? Played rook e1 first because, you know, maybe after a move like queen f3, if I'm black, I'm looking at moves like bishop to c8, now that the bishop's not doing anything on b7, and rerouting that bishop maybe to g4 or a better diagonal. It's just not doing anything on b7. By going rook e1, you obviously can't go bishop c8 now. And if you trade rooks and go bishop c8, I can play rook e8. So it's not quite the same. Interestingly enough, my opponent is a player I grew up studying. So I the position I went for as white, what was telling me to go for this position is maybe studying this guy's game. So he was, maybe it wasn't coincidence, but he was pretty uncomfortable in this position and getting into time trouble. And I was playing one of my favorite players, so I was kind of maybe using stuff I learned against them. But I thought white has a pretty pleasant advantage here, and this a5 pawn is pretty weak in endgames. If you picture all the pieces off of the board, at some point white can try to, if c5 is covered, go for a5, and that will be an outside passed pawn. There's some, that isolated pawn could be a liability. So I thought I had the endgame edge here as well. h5 was played. To play h4. Bishop c8 not possible, not rook e1 because that just gives away the e file. But I mean, bishop a6, bishop a6, what are we doing as white? All the pawn grabbers stand up. What are we doing here? We can actually just take this. You can put your bishop anywhere you want on the board. Anywhere you want. I'm just going to put my queen back to c3. I have no pieces on the light squares, so that discovered attack is nothing. So bishop a6 not possible. Black plays h5. Although if you're a pawn grabber after h5, what can you do? You can do rook takes e1, rook takes e8, queen takes a5. Didn't really go for this. I enjoyed having control over the position, and I wasn't a big fan of the complications that arise after putting my knight to f1 and something like h3. I don't want to lose the game because I went for that pawn on the a file. Black is getting quite a bit of counterplay here. E file, mating threats, wasn't my cup of tea. So after rook e1, h5, okay, we're both getting in a bit of time trouble. I don't want to trade on e1. On e8. I'd like black to trade. I want to get the file completely. Yeah, h3. h3 is what I played, and there's two reasons for that. One of them might be that I want to take that pawn in a variation. Another one is similar to what black did earlier in the game. The key theme is knight regrouping. So I played h3. You don't play h5 to just keep the pawn on h5 usually. Black plays h4. Probably could have played, well, a move like g6, a waiting move. Maybe was a bit worried about weakening the dark squares. Fair enough. There were some better moves, but my opponent was not comfortable in this position. He does play h4. I'd play knight f1, but it comes to my mind immediately that, that knight, I'm not going to put my knight on e3. That's blocking the e file. But I can get the knight to f3. That's an improvement over g3. At least it has a target. And black is starting to run out of moves, though. For example, white is threatening to take on e8 and take on a5. Getting a passed pawn. So black decides to go rook takes e1, finally concedes rook takes e1, bishop c8. I was like, just going to keep improving my position, knight h2. What's nice about the queen on c3 is it attacks a5 and it attacks g7. It's a pretty well placed, I have the e file, I have a nice diagonal along here, and the rook is offside, whereas the queen is not really offside. At least it keeps black honest on the king side with the queen, so it's protecting a lot of squares. Bishop d7. Keep in mind moves like bishop e7 run into some tactics, such as bishop takes g7. Pieces are, discoordinated, and rook takes e7. You can do bishop c5, but you're giving up the back rank. Shouldn't be after bishop c5, rook e8 check. There's going to be some danger. Black plays bishop d7. I'm not going to give up e8. Knight f3. Queen to h6. Queen h5 was also playable. Okay, queen can go back to d8. But black now has two weaknesses, or two kind of loose pawns. b3 is a bit weak for white, but white's pieces are a little bit better. So at this position, I mean, I'm playing, like, in my opinion, I felt like I was playing the best game of my life at this stage. It was a must win, and I'm like putting a 2700 under serious pressure. I mean, it's definitely a good position for white with the e-file, and like my pieces are in good squares. It can't be bad. So I was like, I was getting quite confident here. He's getting in time trouble. He plays queen h6. And played knight e5. I wasn't sure if I should be going for b4, because one thing is, after b4, that I get a passed pawn, but it's a little loose. But the benefit of this is I started having, with the queen offside on h6, maybe I can quickly get a queen b7 in or something. I start having some tactical threats. So this was an alternative. The nice thing is this bishop is not a big factor in the game. This bishop on d4 nicely keeps it passive. So b4 was an option, but okay, in time trouble, I don't need to force it. I can try to wait for black to blunder. Black has many ways to blunder. Keep in mind, if black loses that a5 pawn, it should be a losing endgame. Protected passed pawns, protected outside passed pawns. That's not just a pawn. That's a really important. Like, those are very hard to defend. You can't use your king. You have to tie a piece down. So based on this, I'm like, okay, why is white better? I think white's better because my rook is better. That's what I was thinking, because the rook on a8 is passive. So I was trying to figure out a way to get my rook into the game. But first, I don't really see a nice entry square. I can move my rook here, rook to g5. It's not entirely clear.
But you are dominating the center, right? Bishop, queen, knight, rook.
Felt like I was dominating the center, and I should bring in my knight to join the party. Knight e5. It's nice that my rook on e1's protected. There's no moves like rook e8. Bishop e8. And I'm like starting to get that feeling, that feeling when there's tactics, there's stuff going on. I mean, bishops are fine when they're played back like that, but like, this doesn't look good. I mean, it really feels like white is improving the position. I'm starting to get really excited here. Well, as I said earlier, I don't want my rook on e1 blocked by that knight. That wasn't my plan. After bishop e8, that frees open a square. Knight to g4. Attacking the queen, keeping the file open. Queen to f4. There aren't too many moves here. Obviously, the queen can't, queen has to stay probably on a light square. But the position was so enjoyable because, like, I don't know, queen g6. Okay, there are moves you can play as. Okay, after a move like queen g6, I was seeing in my head funny moves that never normally happen. I was even thinking, oh, I can play like moves like bishop f6. That was like coming into my mind. I mean, I'm starting to get that, like killer instinct. Like black is too passive. Moves like bishop f6 that look kind of outrageous start looking a bit more reasonable. For those wondering why, knight takes f6, the king has to move, and I take the piece, discover, check. There are defenses there, but the fact that I can play a move like this and be okay, it's not a losing move. White can play this move and be okay. I was like, I mean, that can't be bad if I can just leave pieces hanging. So, but I was still calm. I played rook e5. Played queen f4. And I knew queen f4 was a mistake going into the game because I'd planned to bring my rook in. I had planned to bring my rook into the game. And queen f4, I was very happy to respond with rook e5. The queen cannot go back to the safe area anymore. And in this position, the queen has no squares. So after like queen f4, rook e5, the queen's not trapped because I'm not attacking it right now, but it actually does not have any squares. I am actually threatening g3, I think, right? So I thought queen f4 was a blunder. We're both like under 10 minutes. I play rook e5 and I start feeling like I'm going to win. g3 wins the queen. And it's not a very common configuration to trap the queen like this. So I was like, yeah, queen h5 was better. Okay, queen h5, not ideal because of a move like rook e5. So queen g6 was supposed to be played probably. But queen f4, I just dish out rook here, and a move like f6, just g3, just going to ignore that and game over. This would be a really nice game if I was to win like that. I would just, I started getting ahead of myself, started getting thoughts like that. He plays the only move, but I anticipate he plays the only move f5. Why f5? Because I'm not threatening to take the knight if I play g3. It shields the queen to go to g5. Okay, he's 2700, he's not going to let his queen get trapped. I had to wake up to reality there. He's not going to get his queen trapped. I think in Russia you might get sent, to a prison or something if that. If you get your queen trapped by a Canadian chess player, that would be pretty bad. So, f5. And I got really excited here. And I was thinking, I just got really excited here and played something really quickly. When I just got a little bit impulsive, and I thought I saw a win. What win did I? Can anybody guess what I thought? Like the ghost I was seeing after f5. Why bishop e3? Why am I happy about bishop e3? I didn't think f5 worked. I did know that I didn't know f5 was possible. So when he played it, I replied instantly. Why was I happy with bishop e3?
You thought you were winning the pawn on f5.
I thought I was winning the pawn on f5. After bishop e3, I thought the queen has to move to b4. I take on b4, I take on f5, and I'm threatening to play rook f4 and just like take everything. Like rook a5, rook f4, let's say bishop c5, bishop c5. White's up a pawn. This pawn is very weak. Outside pass pawn, black's bishop is bad. This is a very, very good endgame for for white. Rook f5, this is much, much better for white. That's a pawn. There's compensation because you can draw, rook endgames can be drawn, you know how it is, whatever, but white's in a position of strength here. That is a pawn. He plays d4 right away. They always tell you when you're calculating or something, you look at forcing moves. d4 would be the only other move, the only other bone to throw. There's no other way to attack me. Like his pieces, he only has a pawn and a queen near me. So, but I played bishop e3 instantly. I was getting excited and I played quickly. d4.
That's why it's 2700.
d4 is a pretty good move to find with low time, but he's going to find that. Why is d4 so good? Well, first of all, if I do queen takes d4, queen takes, I have a piece hanging. If bishop takes, piece hanging. But why d4 might look intuitively weird at first is white has a check and the queen is hanging. But he had worked out this already. But after d4, I have to go into it. And that's where things go badly, because throughout the game, there was never a clear forcing variation. There's always possibilities. There weren't mass trades ever available. After d4, I have to go for it. Because I can't take on d4. I have to play queen c4 check. Bishop f7. And now there's two different moves. I can take the queen. Bishop takes trade off queens. Black takes the knight. I'm up a pawn here, but these are the ugliest pawns in the world. I don't think I'm beating a Russian Grandmaster in this, but it's actually not good. He plays rook b8. He's getting that rook to b4, and all of a sudden, I'm not sure who's better, because at least he's going to get probably both of those pawns. Rook e6, this isn't winning endgame. Rook b8, rook e6, let's even throw in maybe even a check, but I think mass trades happen. Something like this. I'm not going to be up a clear pawn though, like in the other variation even. This is not a nice pawn. Yeah.
Why not?
I went for the cleaner version of this. That's queen takes f7, so I don't have doubled c pawns. King takes f7, bishop takes queen, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. So now I'm up a pawn, and I hope nobody, he can't play rook b8 here. Cannot play rook b8 because I have rook f5 check. Otherwise, rook b8 would be a good move, hitting b3. But he had seen this position and just coolly played g6. And I'm up a pawn here, and I have absolutely zero winning chances. And that's very impressive. That's impressive that he had calculated all this, because it looks like a clean pawn and then g6. But that d pawn is so strong, and now rook b8 is coming. c5 is a target. I have to keep my rook on e5 because c5 is weak. But I can't do anything with my rook on e5. Black is going to play rook b8 or push the d pawn. I can't stay with my rook on e5. It's blocking my bishop. Like a move like bishop d2, rook b8. These trades, not so good. This endgame, so I'll show how it went. That wasn't the critical point. King f1, bring my king in. Rook a7. Nicely played. Because of rook b8 now, I still had ideas. Maybe I can go for this endgame. Like maybe it's a little bit better for white. I just thought maybe, but he just played rook a7, not even allowing a chance. The rook goes to b7 next move. And so we get into an endgame where I am up a pawn. I'll just show how that happens. I didn't really have a way here. Bishop b6, d3, rook e1. I offered a draw. I had no winning chances. I'll show why. Let's say rook e1, rook a3. I have to pretty much play rook d1. If I play something like a5, my bishop's entombed. And after a move like bishop h6, d2, I'm really passive. That king is going to walk into the game. And even though I'm up a pawn, it's not showing in the position at all. The d3 pawn is much stronger. So rook e1, and there's material equality. The critical point that I had when I should not have rushed a move, I had 10 minutes on the clock and black was playing only moves, was, by the way, even if I had a losing position, I might have gotten a draw because you're allowed, I don't know if anybody, in match situations, if the person can, there's like a common thing where you can even get a draw from a lost position because they just want to win the match. So, but like this was actually just a draw. But I didn't travel from Canada to Norway for that, so I did want to win. And the one chance I had was after f5. I should have obviously taken my time. That's still an issue for me. I'm very impulsive. But knight e3, just keeping the pieces on the board, calmly playing knight e3, attacking f5 is really strong. And I saw knight e3. I saw knight e3, and I saw that it was really good. I just thought I was winning a clean pawn in the other variation. I just thought I was winning a clean pawn. So it's like a good move or a clean pawn. It's like they both seem pretty attractive. Because here, I was looking at bishop d7. So knight e3 hitting g6. You have to defend g6. Say bishop d7. I saw knight c4. Knight c4 is kind of tricky. Why knight c4? Because if pawn takes knight c4, bishop e3 traps the queen in the middle of the board again. And I have knight a5, knight b6. The bishop on f8 is still bad. That bishop on d4 is really good. g6 was a little more worrisome, but that's what I was expecting. Rook takes d5. And this is a bit harder to see. This is harder to see in time trouble. Although those watching the candidates matches saw yesterday somebody pull off a pretty impressive combination in time trouble. So it's definitely doable. Rook takes d5. The thing is, I was looking for tactics. Rook takes d5. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. Queen has to go to b8 here, or yeah, has to go to b8 for the most part. It can't go to e4 because of knight f6. Let's just say queen b8 just to show a variation. Knight f6, king f7. If you put the king on a dark square, I take on e8 with check. Queen c4 check. King e7. And there's a combination here. And after c6, okay, there's a losing variation for black here, and I'm not sure I would have seen all of it. And I don't blame myself for not seeing all of it, but the whole point is I let my opponent get into an endgame. And knight e3 is good, even if I don't find that, because it keeps the pieces on the board and keeps the tension. It keeps the possibility. So even if I don't find a winning the best move after g6, even if I don't find this crazy variation with queen c4, the king walks, I play check, even if I don't find that, I don't go into an endgame. So we can both blunder, but what I went into was an endgame that my opponent just understood immediately. I'm down a pawn, but it's a draw. The queens were off. With the queens on, there was all sorts of possibilities. And he might not even play g6, might have played bishop d7. And immediately after knight c4, you know, white's doing really, really well with bishop to e3. So that was my one shot, and then I just played quick bishop e3, and you saw what happened. It was a draw fairly quickly, and I had no chance afterwards. It was just all forcing. But I thought it was, you know, it was the first time I had outplayed a strong player in a middle game, and we had the entire game was that battle in the c file and on a5, and it looked like I won it. So I thought it was a pretty interesting game. Definitely a setback, but really enjoyable. It was one of I was happy with the effort at least. So that was a game I wanted to share from Norway a few years ago. Ended up drawing the game. So still technically a good result, but I lost the match.